Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's topic is indirect expenses. So in quantity survey, you have both the direct expenses and indirect expenses in rate analysis. So before I go into the details, once again I thank all my viewers, subscribers for your continued support, and please watch till the end. If you like, please share, comment, and if you're not subscribed, please subscribe and press the bell icon. I have also compiled books in civil engineering topics. I will give the details in the description. Therefore, you can look into the details and initiate your buying. So as I said, the topic is indirect expenses. So in quantity survey, in rate analysis, you have direct expenses and indirect expenses. So in direct expenses, you have material cost, labor cost, and other taxes and details also will come. So this falls under direct expenses. And indirect expenses, there are different heads are there. In direct expenses, you have the standard coefficients and market rates. So you can apply and work out the direct expenses cost. Whereas indirect expenses is falls under different heads, and this primarily vary from individual to companies, as well as project, depending upon project sizes, this will vary. So wherever the heads are not applicable, you can always note it is not applicable. Wherever the expenses cost is applicable, you can always work out separately and keep the account of indirect expenses separately. And these indirect expenses can be on pro rata basis. It can be loaded into the unit rates. Suppose if the indirect expenses is about 5% of the total cost, so this can be on pro rata basis, can be loaded into each item of work as under the head indirect expenses. So let us see one by one what are all the indirect expenses. So you have one is pre-contract expenses. Another head will be you have mobilization expenses, or you can say it is pre-construction expenses. That is before you start the construction, there are certain expenses will be incurred. So that is mobilization expenses. And you have expenses during construction phase. So expenses during construction phase is there. So there are three heads under which there are different expenses details will be there. So you can let us see one by one, and it of course it may be applicable for projects, it may not be applicable for some projects. So wherever it is applicable, the cost will be taken. Also, during the tender bids, once during the negotiation, the companies will ask to give the breakup details of costing. So you can explain the rate analysis, how you have calculated and how these indirect expenses are taken. So the client generally may not be aware of all the expenses. So it is for the contractor or the quantity survey team or the contract manager has to explain and make the bid successful. So now pre-contract expenses. In the pre-contract expenses, cost of tender documents. So in case some cases the cost of tender documents will vary from 5,000 to 25,000. So whatever is the cost of document, so that cost can be taken up here. So any expenses which is above 1,000 rupees, you can always figure out in this amount, taking copies for distribution to various departments within the organization. Sometimes you have to take different copies and give to different departments and to get rates. So there is certain cost to it. So that can be taken into this head. Site visit. Sometimes the head office will be in Chennai, the project may be in Madurai, so you need to go to the site visit for bidding purposes. So for this also there is some expenses, so that can also be captured here. Pre-bid meetings. Sometimes the client will call for a pre-bid meeting, so those meetings to attend, there will be some cost to it, so that can be taken. Preparation of bid, taking copies, and submission of bid. Once the bid is prepared and there are certain copies have to be taken and submission of bid, so there are certain costs. Attending tender opening, Again, to attend the tender opening, if it is outside the your place, then there is certain cost. If there is no cost, then no cost, not applicable, it will come. Cost of signing agreement, if there is any cost involved, you can mention it, otherwise it is not applicable. Man hour cost of personnel working on bid preparation, so there will be certain personals working on bid preparation, so there will be certain cost that can be taken. So this all comes under pre-contract expenses, so this can be taken, and the amount is can be calculated accordingly. Then now we have mobilization expenses, or these expenses which are pre-construction stage expenses. So before we start construction, so there will be certain expenses will be incurred. So expenses for obtaining licenses and permit. So we need to take workman compensation, sorry, we have to take contractor license, interstate migrate workers or contractors workers registration. So all this will have some cost that can be taken. Insurance, so car policy is there, contractor all risk policy, this all applicable for a major projects. So whenever this insurance covers all risk in the project. So, Workman Compensation Act, insurance against any accidents and other this thing. So this also insurance expenses will be there. So depending for 100 workers, 200 workers, so this cost can be taken. So another is expenses for maintaining, obtaining and maintaining bank guarantees. So whenever there are bank guarantees has to be submitted for mobilization advance and all, there is certain expenses incurred to the banks. So these can also be taken here. If it is not required, then it is not applicable. So equipment and machinery cost to be apportioned to the project. Whenever we deploy equipments or machineries, so DG sets has to be deployed. In some cases, loaders, JCBs has to be deployed. In some cases, tower crane, batching plant has to be deployed. So there will be depreciation charges. So certain charges has to be apportioned for the project at the pro rata basis. Now you require foundations for equipments and machineries. Suppose you want to place a DG set, you need a platform. You want to have a tower crane, you need a foundation. You want to establish a batching plant, there is a cost involved in it. So those details can be taken here. Generally, these details will not be available in the BOQ. So hence, therefore, this can be calculated separately and taken in the indirect expenses. Now, expenses for bringing the equipments. So, when you need to load it, transport it, unload it, so there is an expenses. So this can be captured here. So similarly, erection charges for these equipments. So whenever you need to bring the equipment, there is a certain erection charges will be there for tower crane, batching plant, genset, etc. So that has to be captured here, and that account, that expenses can be taken up here. Shuttering material cost to be apportioned for the project. So sometimes in BOQ we would have given the shuttering rates, but if you want to have the capital cost, depreciation cost, that can be taken up here. So expenses for bringing shuttering materials to site. So again there is a loading and transporting, unloading will be there. So that expenses can be taken here. So constructing and furnishing site office. So there will be basic site offices depending upon the size of the project. So that cost can be worked out and taken up here. Constructing and furnishing stores. So we need to store the cement. You need to store the other materials as well. So for that purpose, you need a store. So for that, expenses can be worked out and given. Yard fencing, yard lighting. So if you have a yard for storing materials, so there is required to be protected by fencing and all, then you can work out the cost. Lighting, you can work out the cost. So if there is any requirement for constructing approach road, that cost can be worked out and taken here. If demolition of any existing structure and there is no separate BOQ is given, then that can be worked out separately. Site clearances, if there is some jungles or the site has to be cleaned for marking and survey and all, then site clearance expenses can be worked out. Special protection to neighbor structure, barricades, etc. If there is any barricade has to be done to the adjacent properties, then that cost has to be separately worked out, and if it is not in the separate item in BOQ, then it has to be taken care here. So garden net to prevent dust falling and all, so this can be considered and taken separately, worked out and taken here. Another item is drainage facilities to be constructed in case if there is this site falls under rainfall areas and all, you need a proper drainage system so that you don't the works never gets affected during the rains and all. So some facilities and cost has to be worked out and taken here. If any rerouting of any pipelines, electrical lines within the site is there, that cost can be separately worked out. Road diversion for traffic, if any applicable. If it is not applicable, then there is no cost. Safety equipments, helmet, safety belts, safety shoes, you have a ribbons, safety nets, etc. So you can consider a cost here based on the size of the site, and then that can be worked out separately. Lab instruments, so this is a capital cost, so you have different requirements for the project size. So generally CTM machine will be kept at site for concrete testing, and then you have a sieve machine, and then you have various other equipment instruments which is required based on the size of the project. So those capital costs can be taken here. So again, security system for the project, so installing and running cost. So you may have to install CCTV cameras, or you will have security guards, watchmen, etc. at site during the construction phase of the project. So those costs can be calculated, and then it can be worked out and considered here. So you can have a fabrication yard for steel fabrication, or for CC block, concrete blocks, you have to make a yard, and inside the site you are making it that cost. So if any cost is applicable, you can consider at under the head fabrication of yards. Labor accommodation. So if you have to accommodate labor within site or outside site, so those cost, labor, toilets, maintenance, and then their furnishing for labor accommodation, all those heads which is coming under labor accommodation has to be considered here. So expenses for mobilizing labor. Suppose you need to bring labors from the neighboring places at other places, then there is a cost involved for the advances, transportation expenses, and all traveling expenses. So that expenses can be booked here. First aid facility is a mandatory nowadays. So whatever expenses towards first aid is there, you can book under this head. So staff accommodation at site and facilities. So if staffs have to be placed at site, their accommodation expenses plus their facilities like TV, other expenses, newspaper, TVs, etc. that can be captured and then recorded here. Vehicles for site. So depending upon the site, the contractor has to provide vehicles, whether two-wheeler, four-wheeler at site. So that expenses can be pro rata basis can be taken here. Arranging construction water, arranging construction power, if it is in the scope of contractor, then that cost has to be considered here. So it's all based upon the requirements. If it is applicable, the cost will be taken. If it is not applicable, then it is not considered. So expenses during construction phase. So during construction phase, site staff salaries will be there, survey expenses, so that has to be captured depending upon the size of the project. There will be a survey expenses will be there. Expenses for testing at lab, that has to be, because quality control is important. So for testing also there will be certain labors deployed regularly for taking cubes, slump test, collection of samples, etc. So those expenses has to be calculated and considered here. Expenses for periodic testing of equipments and calibration. So it is important to always maintain a calibration certificate of each instrument. So there is certain cost to it, and then that cost can be captured. Travel expenses. So it is a conveyance or travel expenses from HO to site, or whatever the applicable travel expenses can be considered here. Medical expenses can be considered here. Expenses for running and maintaining vehicles. So any vehicles is there. So for running and maintaining of vehicles has to be considered here. Tools, plant, machineries, maintenance can be considered here. So maintenance of expenses, office and accommodation. So both site offices accommodation is provided. So those maintenance expenses for machinery and shuttering materials. So those things has to be captured. Cost of disposing debris. So if there is no separate item in the BOQ, so there will be a lot of debris will be there. So those disposal will be have some cost. So that has to be considered and taken here. Financing costs, if there are certain loans are taken, if there are some delayed payments and all, so there is some cost to it, and that can also be factored and taken here. So head office overheads apportioned for the project. So some portion of head office will be working on this project. So those pro rata basis can be considered and taken under this site. So miscellaneous expenses for discharging social obligation. So there will be some compulsion to make some social obligations. So those expenses, if any, that can be considered here. So similarly, cost of winding up and dismantling, loading and transporting machinery at the end of the project. So demobilizing cost. So that winding up, dismantling, loading, transporting machinery. So that can be worked out separately and then considered here. So we have three heads. One is pre-contract expenses. Second one is mobilization expenses. That is pre-construction stage expenses. And we have third expenses is during construction phase. So that is what given as A plus B plus C. Pre-contract expenses during construction phase is C. B is before start of the construction there are mobilization expenses. So all these three caters to the indirect expenses. So the total indirect expenses may vary for the project to project. It can be from anything between 5 to 10%. So if such expenses can be factored, and then it can be on pro rata basis, can be loaded into your unit rates, and then accordingly the rate analysis can be done. So this is will be helpful during bidding as well as post bid discussion meetings. The contract manager will be explained to give the rate analysis. So at that time, these details will help to convince the client. So you have pre-contract expenses, mobilization or pre-construction stage expenses, or the third one, expenses during the construction phase. So we have come to the end of the video. So if you like it, thanks for watching it. If you like, please comment, share, and if you are not subscribed, please subscribe and press the bell icon. Thank you very much.